So when we were planning GTAC some 4 or 5 months ago, we decided everyone wanted to get somebody famous. And so we sent out an email to Googlers, and we asked them, who do you want? Who would be your dream list of candidates? And we only got like 4 or 5. I mean, it's like cream of the crop. And then when we got the list, we're like, how are we going to get any of these people here? We got one. He's written 5 books. But I've written 5 books. So if I've been accused of being the octo mom of software testing books, then Steve McConnell is the octo dad of software development books. Now, all 5 of my books have sold well. He has one book, Code Complete, that's outsold all 5 of mine combined. I used this book as a professor to teach software development to my students. I learned how, some of the most amazingly simple language to teach people how to code comes from Code Complete. It's a fantastic book. And so on the fame part, I don't appear on anyone's top 10 list. They had a survey of the readers of Software Development magazine who were the most influential people in software. And there were names like Linus Torvalds, Bill Gates, and Steve McConnell. So Steve, welcome to GTAC.
Thank you, James. Well, I'm not sure what to make of James' standard of someone who's famous, but I guess I'll take what I can get. I thought I would start, since this is actually the first time I've talked at a Google event, by describing my own personal brush with someone famous, and it's also how I heard about Google in the first place. I was teaching a class in 1998, I think, in Atlanta, or the Atlanta area, and I had a very nice older lady in one of my classes, and we sat down and had lunch together. And she was interesting to me because, A, she was an older woman who had a PhD in computer science, and B, she had a son who was a computer programmer. And she was one of the first people I met who actually had a kid that was a second-generation computer programmer. And she was very proud of her son, and she was very proud of the company he had started, and it turned out that her son was Larry Page, and the company that he started was Google. And so that's how I heard about Google back in 1998 or so. And I guess it's nice to have a mom who's out there selling for you. And so anyway.
Sell you some stock.
Yeah, that's another good point. Thank you. So our topic today is secrets of world-class software development. And it looks like James gave me a clicker here, so let's see how that works. I don't know. Okay. So I think depending on who you ask, you might get several different ideas about what makes a world-class software organization. If you ask Larry Page's mom, she might say a world-class software organization is an organization that spells its name Google. And that's not actually Larry Page's mom, by the way, at least not as far as I know. If you asked Capers-Jones, estimation and measurement guru in the software world, what makes something world-class, he would say something like, well, it depends on Baldrige Award winners and going through Six Sigma and having a defect rate per 1,000 lines of code is less than X, or some kind of answer like that. If you were to ask somebody like Watts Humphrey, he might have said, well, we think it's an organization that's operating at CMM level 5 and has highly controlled and repeatable processes and is optimizing and so on. If you were to ask the guys who put together the Agile Manifesto, they might say, well, it's a team that is remaining very flexible to changes in requirements and constantly responding to changes in the business environment and being very flexible and adaptable and so on. None of those are my definition. When I think about my definition of world-class, I ask a couple of questions. And one of those questions is, can you have a world-class software organization inside a mediocre business? And that's an interesting question, I think. If you have a mediocre business, is it possible that that somehow contains a world-class software organization? And James just spoke at an event I hosted earlier this week, which was the 2011 Software Executive Summit. Back in 2004, we held our first or second Software Executive Summit. And we had a famous, well-known software guru in a panel discussion. and we had a bunch of executives in the audience, and this guru, James, could I trouble you to get my bottle of water from the back? Thank you so much. And so this guru, somebody made the point about, well, we were describing some kind of project, and this guru went through and described the project and described what great technical work it had done and what great architectural work they had done and how it was delivered with very high quality. And he said, and he sort of concluded, thank you so much. He sort of concluded by saying, well, and somebody said, well, how did the product do? And he said, well, it was one of those cases where you had a great technical success, but a business failure. And I think practically every single executive in the audience almost jumped out of their chairs at the same time and said, no, there is no such thing as a great technical success and a business failure if the reason is that it failed in the marketplace due to not actually adequately understanding the needs of the market. And they basically were saying, we think at the executive level, technical success includes taking ownership of product viability, and you have to take ownership of that success in the marketplace. And that was very interesting to me, not just in the nature of the reaction, but in the extent of the reaction, because practically every single person reacted the same way. So I don't think you can have a world-class software organization inside a mediocre business. I think you can have a mediocre software organization at best. And then there's the related question, can you have a mediocre software organization inside a world-class business? And of course, this was the accusation that was leveled at Microsoft for many years, where many people would say, oh, Bill Gates, he's kind of mediocre technically, but he's a business genius. And I would disagree with that characterization fairly strongly. I think that just like you can't have a world-class software organization inside a mediocre business, you can't really have a mediocre software organization inside a world-class business because it's simply not going to be adequate to support the needs of that world-class business if it is truly all things considered mediocre. And so my view of world-class is maybe a little different than some people might think, but my view of world-class is a software organization that effectively supports business objectives of a successful business. So effectively supports the business objectives of a successful business. And so now let's drill into that a little bit. I think that this means providing software that is on time, on budget, with desired functionality at the defined quality level and in a sustainable way. I think there's some overlap here with various things I've written over the years about 10x software engineering, where we've got lots of research that's found that different developers will vary by a factor of 10 in all kinds of dimensions: productivity, number of defects they insert into the software, number of the rate at which they remove defects from the software, and so on and so on. And researchers have also found 10x differences between different organizations that are working on similar kinds of products in both productivity and quality. So there's some overlap with that. Now, before I get into telling you what I think are the attributes of world-class software organizations, let me give you some background on where my ideas come from. One bit of background is that my company engages, there we go, on a consulting basis with at least dozens of companies every year. So we've formed some opinions over the years about what makes some organizations more effective and some less. We visit hundreds of companies a year on a training basis, and so we form some additional opinions that way. We host events like the Executive Summit that I hosted earlier this week, where we have in-depth discussions with executives from literally around the world, and we get some ideas that way. We also participate pretty broadly in industry organizations like the IEEE, Object Management Group, Local Software Improvement Network, and so on. And then we have also conducted research. We've done surveys of our own. We've led discussion groups and focus groups, online forum discussions, and of course we read what other people write as well. So there are a lot of different sources of data feeding into this. We've worked with lots of clients and lots of companies across really the full spectrum of industries, and I think that's given us a pretty interesting perspective. I think most people tend to work all in aerospace, or all in e-commerce, or all in shrink wrap, or all in embedded medical devices, and we get to see all of that stuff, and that gives us an interesting perspective on what the full range of different kinds of software and different practices include. Now, of those companies that we've worked with, how many of those can we actually talk about? Well, guess what? You would assume if we worked with you, we're covered by non-disclosure agreements in the vast majority of cases, and even in the rest of the cases, I don't think it would be appropriate for me to share details that we learned through a confidential engagement. So the rest of what I'm going to talk about definitely draws from our up-close and personal look at all of these companies, but the details I'm going to give you are details that have been presented in public forums or published in articles or books or that kind of thing. So the color commentary here is not secret. So let's take a look at a sample of world-class software organizations. And this was really just intended to give you a flavor of organizations that we've seen over the years that I think really represent that model of software development that is fully and effectively supporting a successful business. The first one that I'm going to present, everyone hold back a little bit, is Microsoft, and note circa 1990. So this is the time frame that I was on campus at Microsoft, and I'm not going to make any claims one way or the other about where Microsoft might be today, but back in 1990, I think very clearly Microsoft was truly a world-class software organization. That knock about Bill Gates being technically mediocre but a business genius, I think absolutely not true. Bill was the most highly respected technical guy in the organization. It was a very common joke in the organization that Bill knew more about your job than you did. There were many stories floating around the organization about somebody who was an architect level person and they'd been working on something for months, and they went to a barbecue and they happened to bump into Bill Gates and started talking to Bill about their work, and Bill asked a series of probing questions that resulted in them having to go back and completely redesign 3 months worth of work. Lots of stories like that. So super sharp guy. I think most people outside Microsoft never really understood just how well respected Bill was technically in that organization. So here are some of the attributes that I think were significant. One, extremely selective hiring. In that time frame, Microsoft was mostly hiring people who were fresh out of school. They were recruiting at Stanford, MIT, Waterloo, and University of Washington. That was about it. Other than that, there were certain people hired from other places, but the main recruiting emphasis was highly selective. Another thing that was really interesting and that was quite disconcerting when I first got there was a level of completely unvarnished, in some respects uncivil, bare-knuckle discussions where people stayed ruthlessly focused on the technical merits of the discussion with absolutely no consideration for anyone's human feelings. And I got the impression some of the times when I was watching these guys when I first got there for the first few months, I'd watch these guys go out in these meetings and I'd think, these guys hate each other. I think they're actually going to hurt each other. And then somebody would say, hey, look, it's 12, it's time to go to lunch. And these two guys would go, oh yeah, where are we going to go for lunch? Okay. And it's like those Foghorn Leghorn cartoons where the dog and the chicken chase each other around all the time and then the whistle goes off and they just sit down and have their lunch together. It felt exactly like that. So very strong focus on the technical work. Microsoft also had this really well-defined and highly disciplined stage gate process. No, I'm just kidding. They didn't have that at all. They had a total cowboy culture, and there was nothing even remotely resembling a disciplined process, at least as far as the software development practices were concerned. And then there was this very interesting cultural dynamic where if you were in a meeting, and a technical meeting, and people were talking about should we go down path A or should we go down path B, and you were arguing about the technical merits of these two paths, there would often come a time where somebody would say, hey, look, and typically the argument would be, well, path B is expedient, will get us there sooner, but path A is really the better path technically and will give us a longer-lived code base and so on, give us more reliability and so on. There would be a point in that discussion where somebody would say, hey, listen, we've got to do the right thing here. And that phrase had almost a magical power at that time at Microsoft, where if somebody invoked the concept of do the right thing, people would sit back in their chairs, and it really did cause people to say, okay, what is really important here? And at the time it was pursuing the path that was the best path technically. So some pretty interesting cultural aspects. Chris Peters made this very interesting comment in the context of Excel 3.0. Excel 3.0 was widely regarded at the time as the most successful project that had been done in the history of the company. It shipped 11 days late on a one-year schedule, and Chris Peters went around and lectured various groups at Microsoft. They made a videotape, and lots of people watched the videotape of the lecture. And he pointed out the goal is not to write code. If we could ship products and make all this money without writing any code, we would. Your job is to ship products exactly on time. It doesn't matter whether you're a developer, tester, program manager, product manager, whatever. Everybody's job is the same. And the emphasis here is interesting because what they're saying is the job here is not to create cool technical stuff. The job here is that we are running a business, and the business is shipping products. And shortly after this, Microsoft engaged in quite an explicit cultural re-engineering program because there was this thread of people kind of getting just going down rat holes on interesting technical challenges, but not actually doing things that generated revenue. And so they launched this program where they gave people these enormous Ship It awards. They're these clear lucite things that are about this big. They weigh, I don't know, 10 or 15 pounds. They are massive awards. I mean, you could, if you're in an earthquake and this thing falls off the top shelf, you want to get out of the way because it is a danger. But Microsoft was very clearly trying to communicate a message that we are in the business of software, and we stay in business by focusing on the business and shipping product. I think they did some other things well too. In the company that I had worked at immediately prior to Microsoft, it was a very typical sort of bureaucratic bean counting company. And literally, if I needed a pad of Postit Notes, I had to go up to the 10th floor, and I had to go to a person who was standing in a locked cage, and I had to say, I need a pad of Postit Notes, and I had to give them my department number for accounting purposes, and then they would give me the pad of Postit Notes, and I would have to sign for the pad of Postit Notes. And so when I went to Microsoft, they just had Postit Notes. I was amazed. They had, I mean, this is all routine now, right? You could go into the break area and they would have Postit Notes and pens, and at the time floppy diskettes and backup tapes and staplers and everything else you could possibly need to do your job. And they'd also had sweated some operational details that I thought were amazing, again, at the time. If I needed a whiteboard in my office, I didn't have to fill out a form. I sent email and they would to operations, and they'd send me a note back that said, put a Post-it note on the wall where you want the whiteboard. And I thought, wow, I even have Post-it notes to do that. And so I put the Post-it note on the wall, and the next day when I came to work, there would be a whiteboard there. And same thing, if my computer went down, they would come in, they would take my hard disk out of the computer, they would stick it in a new computer that they had just brought, and then they'd take my computer away. I'd never see it again. But my downtime, I mean, my other jobs, if I had a computer go down, it could be days or weeks until I got my computer fixed, but there, it was basically a matter of 20 minutes or something like that. And the key thing here is the amazing laser-like focus on making sure that the people who are doing the work are supported in such a way that they can keep doing the work, and that was a new experience for me. Then another thing I thought was interesting, there was a story that was floating around in widespread distribution where the story went like this. The story said, there was this case on the product where there was a senior technical lead, and the senior technical lead wanted to take the product this direction. And there was a marketing VP, and this marketing VP really, really disagreed and wanted the product to go a different direction. And the two of them had a big argument, and neither of them could agree, and the marketing VP ended up getting fired. And that was the story. And the thing that's interesting about that is I never heard any names. I heard that story from at least 5 different sources. I never heard any names attached to the story. But culturally, there was very clearly a message being sent that if you're a technical person, you need to stand up and do what you think is right, and the company will back you up, and if necessary, fire the marketing VP. But the general idea being that, you know, if you're a technical person, you will be backed up if you do what you really think is right. The work ethic was, I think, extraordinary. I remember one time, it was Friday night, I was getting ready to go home, some people came by and said, hey, you want to go to a movie? And so I'm like, okay, sure. So we left about 5 or 6, and we went out and we got a hamburger somewhere, and then we went to a movie, and when the movie was over, we all went back to work. Because what else are you going to do on a Friday night at 10? Of course you're going to go back to work. And that's what the culture was like then. I had a coworker whose mother was very concerned because on Christmas Day, she called her at home, she wasn't there. She called her at her boyfriend's house, she wasn't there. She called her at work, and there she was. Where else would she be on Christmas Day? She had work to do. There's a story that I can't remember if I've actually put this in print or if it's been reported anywhere else, but I think is interesting. Back when Microsoft and IBM were collaborating on OS/2, and a lot of you probably don't remember that, but it was an operating system, and the joke was half an operating system, OS/2. So IBM was doing part of the project, and Microsoft was doing part of the project, and Microsoft really wanted to deliver as close to on time as it could. And Steve Ballmer was not the head of the company at that time. He was head of a business unit. And he went in and said to the OS/2 guys, what do you need? What do you need in order to make this thing ship on time? And the team didn't want a big reward. They didn't want the promise of a big bonus. They didn't need on-site masseuses or anything like that. What the team said is, the one thing that would really help is if we could get a washer and dryer installed in our building, then we wouldn't have to go home to do our laundry. And that would really help us get a lot more work done. And I think that's an amazing level of buy-in, isn't it? If you can get your team so that the only thing they ask for is a washer and dryer so they can stay at work longer, it's an extraordinary level of commitment to the project. And that's the level of commitment that they had. Now, let's take a look at a second company that I think is clearly also world-class by my definition, and that is Google. For this audience, I probably don't need to belabor the details too much, but we've got amazing amenities like the on-site chef and haircuts and laundry service and car washes and mechanics and your own buses, because God knows you never want to mix with the regular people that are on the regular buses. And then we have, and I think in a lot of ways, I see Google as Microsoft 2.0. And I think, looking at it from the outside, to me that kind of looks like it's by design. It looks to me like Google has studied the Microsoft playbook pretty well. We have very selective hiring, same as Microsoft in 1990. We have this 20% think time, which I'm not quite sure exactly how that plays out. I hear different stories about how that actually plays out on the ground, but here are some stories that it plays out, at least at times, pretty well. I think, again, from reports I hear, same kind of what I would characterize as cowboy culture. Not a lot of attention to process, but there are some people I think who are working that issue a little bit. And then we have this fascinating comment from Eric Schmidt. Isn't this fascinating? The goal is to strip away everything that gets in our employees' way. We provide a standard package of fringe benefits, but on top of that are first-class dining facilities, gyms, laundry rooms, massage rooms, etc. Just about anything a hardworking employee might want. Let's face it, programmers want to program. They don't want to do their laundry. And so like I said, I think Google has taken some plays out of Microsoft's playbook. So let's take a break for a minute. We've been talking about two companies, Microsoft 20 years ago, Google today. What factors really matter? When I make the comment, Microsoft had kind of a cowboy culture, Google's not paying a lot of attention to process. What factors really matter? Well, as some of you know, I've been fixated on software estimation for quite a long time, and so I tend to see a lot of the world through estimation-colored glasses, if you will. And the best-known estimating model is the Kokomo model. Barry Bain initiated this model a very long time ago, in the mid-1970s, and it's been updated often since then. In the Kokomo model, there are 22 factors that are seen as having influence on software project outcomes. And the length of these bars on this graph represents the magnitude of the possible influence that each of these factors has on project outcomes. So at the very top, we've got product complexity having the highest individual possible outcome. I don't know if you can make out the number at the top, but it's a 2.38. And what that says, according to the Kokomo model, is that if you have a product with highest complexity, that will take 2.38 times as much total effort as a product with the lowest complexity, all other factors being equal, including size in lines of code. So this is just a measure of how intricate and complex the code is, not how much there is, but how intricate it is. And we go through some other factors. Now, what's interesting about this is, of the 22 factors, 17 of them don't vary on a percentage basis depending on the size of the project. They're static. So if I've got a 10,000 line of code project, product complexity can vary by 2.38. If I've got a 10 million line of code project, then product complexity still varies by 2.38. But the 5 factors that are shown in darker orange or red, those factors in the Kokomo model, which has been developed through quite extensive data analysis, those factors are seen as varying with project size. And so at a large size project like this, 5 million lines of code, we've got factors like process maturity that actually have a big influence on project outcome. We've got architecture and risk resolution has a big outcome, precedentedness has a big outcome, and so on. But look what happens when we go to a smaller size project. Once we go to a smaller size project, 100,000 lines of code, and that's still a pretty good sized project. That's not a tiny project by any means. Now we have all of these factors like process maturity, architecture and risk resolution, and team cohesion and so on are in the bottom half of the list in terms of their degree of influence. And the big takeaway from this is if you look at how these factors vary at different sizes, is if you're in a startup mode, or even if you're in your first maybe 10 years, an awful lot of your projects are going to be more in this size range. But as you get into a more mature business, the nature of how this works is the longer companies stay in business, the longer they accumulate code against the same code bases, and the bigger their code bases get. I met earlier today with a company that is not that old, and their code base is 45 million lines of code for one product. So, really big product. And the thing is, the factors that you have to care about when you're big versus the factors that you have to care about when you're small are different. And so, if I'm Microsoft or in the early days, or Amazon in the early days, or Google in the early days, why should I care about process? It's a second-tier factor. But as I become more mature, have bigger code bases, I have to start caring about it because it has more influence over my project. Now, the other thing that's interesting is a lot of these factors you have no control over. They're handed to you by the nature of the business you're in. Product complexity is largely determined by the area that you're working in. If you're working on safety-critical embedded systems, you're going to have a high degree of complexity, and you can't really get away from that. If you're working on online business systems, you're going to have a much lower degree of complexity, and that's a benefit that you can leverage. There are a very small number of factors that individual project teams typically have any direct control over, and those are shown as in the red bars on this graph. And then most of the rest of the factors are controllable only at the organizational level. So that means you typically have to have somebody above the programmer or even above the manager level to make much of a difference in those factors. All right, so let's continue with our sample of world-class software organizations. This is a company that's a Canadian company, and they had invited me to come up. This is quite a while back. It was when my book, Software Project Survival Guide, was fairly newly out. And they'd invited me to come up and do a workshop for their managers. And before I went up, I said, is there anything in particular that you'd like me to focus on? And they said, if you could help us get a handle on our estimation challenges, that would really probably be the best thing you could do for us, because that's a nut that we've just had a really hard time cracking. And if you can help us make progress there, that would be a big win for us. So as I worked through the class, I was trying to figure out, well, what is the source of these estimation challenges? And I thought at first, well, maybe it's bad estimation, and that's kind of one of the obvious ones. And it turned out they had a fairly elaborate estimation process, one of the more elaborate processes I'd ever seen, actually. And I thought, well, maybe they're not really calibrating their estimating models very well. But actually, it turned out they had 30 years of historical data. They had collected historical data on every project they'd ever done, so that wasn't the issue. And I thought, well, okay, well, maybe they just don't have really effective plans. Maybe their plans are really unrealistic. And it turned out, no, they actually put their project managers through extensive training on project planning. They actually tracked progress according to plan. They had a very disciplined approach of revising the plans if the project was getting too far away from the plans. So that wasn't it. So I thought, well, maybe it has something to do with quality. Maybe they're putting a lot of defects in, and they're not detecting them until toward the end of the project. And we talked about that, and it turned out they were actually extremely disciplined. They were doing full formal inspections. They were tracking defect phase escape rates from one activity to the next. And I finally got to a point where I said, as far as I can tell, you guys actually are one of the better run organizations I've ever seen. Just how bad are your software estimation problems anyway? And they said, well, we're probably being a little hard on ourselves because we do deliver 97% of our projects on time and on budget, but we really can't figure out how to get that last 3%. And so that actually was one of the first data points in what I came to see as a long-standing pattern, which is a lot of the most effective organizations are also the most self-critical. And we have seen that pattern quite a few times since then. And the opposite of that is also true. We have also seen organizations, this is not one of the best companies, it's not up here for a reason. I gave the same presentation to another company, and I gave it 2 days in a row. I gave it first in one location, and I got the feedback forms. I looked at the feedback, and most of the feedback was, we already know this stuff. This is old, it's not, we don't need to do this stuff, we're past that. I went and showed it to the VP who had brought me in. I said, are we really sure we're on the right, targeting the right class here? Because the feedback says we're not even, we're not really hitting the mark. And he says, that's one of the problems we've got here. These guys are nowhere near as good as they think they are. Let me show you this graph. And so he pulled up a graph that showed me their actual versus estimated performance. And he had a data set of 80 projects. And out of those 80 projects, they had one that was on time. And so that sort of overconfidence we've also seen as a pattern where the organizations that are the least self-critical are also often the least effective. And so we've seen both sides of that pattern. All right, interlude number 2, what factors really matter? There's a book that describes an approach that I really like called Discipline of Market Leaders. And what this book says is that there are 3 value dimensions that companies can possibly focus on. One of them is operations. And operations basically says, we're just going to be as efficient as we possibly can. We're going to look for fat in our process. We're going to try to make our processes operate as efficiently and in as streamlined a way as we possibly can. And that's one possible route to excellence. A second value dimension is product leadership. And in product leadership, what we're typically focusing on, and at least in our industry, is innovation. So we can focus on developing the most innovative products possible, on being the state of the art, leading the industry, that kind of thing. And then the third value dimension is customer intimacy. And so in customer intimacy, we just focus on understanding our customers better than anybody else could possibly understand them. And so we might not be that great technically, we might be inefficient operationally, but we meet our customer needs so well that we still can be an industry-leading company. And the idea behind this is companies can typically excel in only one of these 3 dimensions. They can suffice in 2 of them, but they really only ever excel in one of them. And so thinking about your organization, which one do you really excel in? And for a lot of technology companies, it's going to be the middle one, the product leadership or the innovation. But there are exceptions. I mean, Intuit is an interesting example. For many years, Intuit's claim to fame really was knowing the customer better than any other company in the industry did. And when I was starting my career 25 years ago, Intuit had this famous program of follow the customer home. They literally be at the software store, which we had back then, and they would watch the person buy the software, and they would follow the person home and watch them install the software on their computer and watch them start trying to use it. And it's an extraordinary level of customer intimacy, which is a little bit rare for a tech company, I think, but just to show you that it can be done in a technical environment. So this is something to file away, I think, in the back of your mind and say, well, which dimensions does my company really focus on, and what dimension might I think we should try to excel in? All right, so with that as background, NASA Software Engineering Lab would be the next organization I would nominate as being a world-class software organization. And this is an interesting organization because it is extraordinarily quantitatively focused. They collect data on everything. They analyze data to the nth degree. They package the data up. They put it in manuals and estimating models and defect production models and all kinds of stuff like that. And so they're extraordinarily quantitatively and mathematically oriented. But they publish a list of their top do's and don'ts. And interestingly enough, their top do's include, in this highly quantitative organization, Do empower project personnel. Doesn't sound that quantitative, does it? Do minimize bureaucracy. Sounds kind of like the opposite of what you might think with somebody who's extraordinarily process focused. They were the first organization to win the IEEE's Software Process Achievement Award, and they're saying minimize bureaucracy. Do take periodic snapshots of project health and replan when necessary. So no pathological commitment to a plan or to process, and emphasis on doing what works. Do foster a team spirit. That's pretty touchy-feely. And do start the project with a small senior staff. And it's fascinating to me that for this incredibly process-oriented, quantitatively oriented organization, that their top list of do's have more to do with the people on the team than they do with any sort of quantitative method. Boeing is another company that I'd like to touch on for a moment. I think Boeing's a vast organization, and I don't really believe that every part of Boeing would qualify as world-class necessarily. But they really are extremely quantitative, and in some cases they have been extraordinarily effective. When they were developing the 777 project, for example, they had a 5-year schedule for the avionics software for the airplane. And 18 months into their 5-year schedule, they were tracking their progress carefully, and they identified that if they continued on that course, they were going to overrun by about 5%. So that's kind of interesting in itself, isn't it? 18 months in, they've identified a 5% variance from plan. And so at that point, they added some staff, which when you're 18 months into a 5-year project, you can still safely do. And they cut a little bit of functionality, and they ended up delivering their project, the avionics software, which is safety critical, and several million lines of code, on time at the end of 5 years. And you know, what's interesting about that to me is I think some people's reaction would be, well, yeah, of course, if you take corrective action 18 months into a 5-year project, of course you're going to deliver on time. And yet, how many projects have we seen that didn't take corrective action and managed somehow to overrun that long schedule by another year or 2 or 3 or 4? We've seen lots of companies that do that. And so I think that's a pretty extraordinary accomplishment. Similarly to Microsoft, during the time I spent at Boeing, they had a magic phrase in their organization too. It wasn't do the right thing, it was this phrase here. If we can't find the time to do it right, where are we going to find the time to do it over? And just like invoking that phrase at Microsoft, in the Boeing context, when somebody wanted to take a shortcut that was expedient in the short term, but that was going to undermine quality or undermine progress before the end of the project, someone would invoke this phrase, and people would sort of sit back in their chairs and cause them to stop and think. And I thought it was very, very powerful organizationally. The last specific company that I want to highlight for you is Symantec, and I think this is an interesting example. I think the fortunes of this company have kind of ebbed and flowed, but I think they've got some very, at times anyway, have had some extremely innovative practices. One practice that I find fascinating in this company is what they call uncommitted features of opportunity, or UFOs. And the idea here is that if I'm a developer and I finish my work, my assigned work early, then as a reward for finishing my assigned work early, I get to go pick one of these uncommitted features of opportunity off the list, and I get to implement that on top of the work that I already signed up to do. And it's kind of interesting, isn't it? And so my reward for finishing my work early is to get to do more work. But there's a great deal of organizational cachet that goes into actually having delivered one or more of these uncommitted features of opportunity. So it's cool to actually have gotten done with your work early and delivered a UFO. And I think the cultural message there is interesting, right? The cultural message is if you do your work well, you get acknowledged for being somebody who's a high performer. This organization is, in at least one respect, one of the most interesting, has one of the most interesting accountability policies that we've seen. And we've seen this in only 2 companies. But in their change control process, if the sales or marketing group comes in after the requirements have been established and want to make a change, then we all are used to maybe seeing on the development side where we'll say, okay, if we do that, that's going to increase our schedule by a week or whatever. But in this case, they require the marketing and sales organization to increase their sales quotas in support of the change as well. So they're saying if you want us to make a change that has a cost and schedule impact, then you got to sign up for an increase in your sales projections, because if you don't think there's an increased sales potential, then why are we even talking about this? We've only seen 2 companies in the last 15 years that actually have that level of discipline around the business side of the change control process. I think they have a very interesting business focus. One of their promotion criteria is, as they promote technical staff, part of the criteria for promoting technical staff is they promote people who have a portfolio of product wins. It's not project wins, it's not technical wins, it's product wins, and that's the criteria for promoting technical staff. And I think in essence what they're saying is, at the end of the day, we are a business, and the technical work exists to support the business, and we're not quite sure what the secret sauce is in this person's work that leads to creating successful products. But when we look at their portfolio of product wins, whatever that secret sauce is, we want more of it. And we want it to have more influence on our organization. So we're going to promote those people that have a portfolio of product wins and give them more influence over our organization. And one person that we know in that organization referred to Symantec as a world-class seat-of-the-pants organization. I think that's a great characterization. They're not trying to become excessively formal or bureaucratic. They are just trying to fine-tune their own processes for their own purposes as much as they possibly can. So I think we're at a point where we can actually draw some conclusions. You might think back. We've talked about Google, we've talked about Microsoft, we've talked about Boeing, we've talked about MDA, we've talked about NASA, and finally we used some examples from Symantec. What could these organizations possibly have in common? Well, I actually think they have a lot in common if we take a step back. One is, I think there's an emphasis on top talent. Now, the top talent gets defined different ways in different places. If I'm NASA, I'm probably not hiring from the same talent pool as Google, but one way or the other, I'm going to try to hire the top talent that I can. I think there's an emphasis on support for top talent, whether it's the lavish perks that Google provides in present day, or whether it was what was seen as lavish support for developers in the Microsoft era. I think we see at least an attempt to provide as much support as we can. Now, if we're a large governmental bureaucracy like NASA, there are going to be some limits on how much we can do that. But there the support might be just more in terms of letting people work on this amazingly cool stuff. I mean, not everybody gets to work on software that sends rocket ships to Mars or that kind of thing. So there are some offsetting benefits. I think a strong sense of mission. When you're working for NASA and you get to send a satellite to Mars, I can see how you create a strong sense of mission there. I mean, that's pretty cool, right? Or you're working on the software for the space shuttle and you're meeting the astronauts whose lives depend on your software. There's a sense of mission that comes with that automatically. But when you're working for Microsoft and you're working on the next generation word processor, I mean, it's really a pretty amazing accomplishment that Microsoft or any comparable company can get people to feel incredibly invested in making the fonts look cooler on the screen or that kind of thing. And I think in the software world we have, if you take a step back and you say, what is our track record on getting people bought into having a really high sense of mission, and then what are we actually working on? I think we've got some amazing success stories in software for getting an extraordinary degree of buy-in to things that are not, next generation medical devices or sending somebody to the moon, but that, from some point of view might be somewhat mundane, and yet we extract an extraordinary level of buy-in and a sense of mission. And I think that's true across all of these organizations. I think we have a high degree of alignment with the mission. It's not good enough to say we have a strong sense of mission if people are actually working off at an angle to the mission. You've got to get all the vectors lined up. And the organizations that have done well, I think, do a good job of aligning people's personal interests with the interests of the business. The very first consulting assignment I did after founding Construx more than 15 years ago was one where I got hired by a company in Vancouver. And I got hired by I was mainly talking to the CEO and owner of the company, and he said, you know, I'm just really concerned. We're working on this sort of movie special effects software, and I just don't think my guys I don't think they're bought in. I don't think they're really working toward the deadline. I give them deadlines. I just don't think they're really, you know, very committed. And in my mind, which at the time was still much more of a developer mind than a business guy mind, my mind was saying, oh, geez, this is a typical executive who's trying to apply schedule pressure to his developers and trying to hold their feet to the fire. This guy sounds like a jerk, but I was trying to get my company established, so I said, okay, fine, we'll come up and take a look. So we went up and we interviewed a bunch of the staff members, and we talked to the president, owner of the company, and we talked to their lead architect, we talked to some of the testers, and we talked to some of the developers, and we found out that he was 100% correct. The software they were working on was amazingly cool. It had all these great graphics, and they were literally doing movie special effects, and so they did not care at all when the software shipped. All they cared about was, you know, getting that one particular visual effect to look exactly right, and he was right on. There was just absolutely, they could have cared less what the schedule was. And so the more successful companies, I think, do a much better job of getting alignment with the mission, and take some pretty explicit steps, like Microsoft did with the Ship It Award and that kind of thing. I think there's real business accountability, whether it's Chris Peters telling people your job is to ship products, or whether it's Symantec giving promotions for a portfolio of product wins. There is a focus on accountability to the business. There's a commitment to quality. Clearly, if you are Boeing working on avionics software, your definition of quality is going to be different than if you're Google and you're working on search engine results. But however quality needs to be defined for the kind of software where you're working on it, there's going to be a commitment to quality in a world-class organization. I think frequent introspection is also a common denominator. The best companies are pretty self-critical. When they make a mistake, they look at it as a learning opportunity. And I think another thing that's interesting is that so-called standard practices become highly adapted to the local environment. When I started working as a consultant 15 years ago, I had more of an idea that here's the template, this is the right way to do it, and then we'll just see how much companies vary from that template. What we've learned over time is that the companies that are doing the best just break the template, because they have taken the ideas that are in some sense standard practices, and they have refined them and refined them and refined them in ways that work well in the context of their organizations, but often in ways that are completely non-transferable to other organizations because they're so highly adapted to the local needs of the organization. And finally, I think the best organizations end up attaining a high degree of staff commitment, but this is something that I think a lot of people miss. The staff commitment is not a cause, it is an effect. The staff commitment is what you get by doing a great job on all the other areas, getting a high degree of buy-in, creating a sense of mission, supporting the staff the best you can, and so on. The result of all that is that at Microsoft in 1990, people would come back to work on Friday night after going to the movies. But that's not because anybody's asking for it. It's because that's what people want to do as a result of doing a great job on all these other things. I think one of the more pathological patterns that we see is organizations that think the staff commitment comes first, and they try to force that, and they ignore these other factors, and then they end up getting neither. They don't get the world-class contribution, and they don't get the staff commitment either, because people just resent being asked to work that much. So that's my list of attributes of world-class software organizations, and at this point I would open the floor to comments or questions.
Hi, thanks for your talk. My question is around staff motivation. So you've got, a high-class, well-trained engineer, and he's really good, or she's really good, at writing cool software, and what they really want is to be rewarded for writing cool software. And what I'm hearing from you is what a business really wants is engineers who develop good product. And they actually need business skills to be able to do that. And I think what you find is a lot of engineers who are like, well, I'm not sure my project is going anywhere. I'm not sure it's a really good idea. I'm doing cool stuff, but I don't know that it's going to have impact on the business, and I don't know how to impact that. So what do you do for these engineers who are lacking in business skills and feeling like they are lacking the ability to impact that change?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and it's a question that every business should be asking, and it's a question that most businesses don't ask nearly enough. I can give you a simple answer that will get you 80% of the way toward the 80% of the way toward the solution, and the other 20% is really hard. I think it requires a lot more complicated discussion. But the simple answer that we've seen, and if I were to publish Rapid Development today, I would include a chapter on this as a best practice. It's a short chapter because it's not a complicated idea, but it's basically make sure that your technical staff goes out and observes real customers, real users using the software in a real environment. And I can't tell you how many upper-level executives I've talked to over the last 5 to 10 years that have reported numerous variations on the theme of, I had a team who didn't seem to get the business needs, and they just didn't understand what we're doing. And then we took them out, and we spent a couple days or a week at the customer site, and the whole team came back as incredible evangelists for the needs of the customer. And now we had these meetings where they were talking to the business analyst, and the business analyst was saying, well, we should do this, and the team was saying, no, the customers do it this way. And so I think you get 80% of the answer to that question just by getting your team in contact with real customers. And depending on the nature of your organization, some companies are nervous about exposing their unwashed masses of developers to their customers because they're worried that they're literally unwashed masses of developers. And you have to find a way to get past that, because I think it's a proxy for so many other things. And some companies will, I think, take a half step that's not bad, but it is a half step of having their developers or technical staff take product support calls. I think that's okay as far as it goes, but I don't think it's anywhere near as good as actually getting the developers out there seeing how the customers are using the software. I mean, hearing it on the phone is one thing, but looking at somebody get frustrated and in trying to do something that you thought was cool, but that you see somebody use it, and there's like a little thing that goes on the screen that adds a half a second, and you're like, wow, it was so cool when I programmed it. And then you see how frustrated people get when it delays what they're trying to do by a half second every time they try to do it. That kind of stuff is invaluable. So that would be my 80% answer. Yeah.
You've talked about Google and Microsoft 20 years ago and some other examples of world-class software organizations. But what I wanted to know is, what are the signs of decaying of this world-class organization?
Yeah.
So what are the first signs?
Well, if I was Google, that would be the question I would ask. And I actually was thinking about that because I was hoping that question would come up. I think, if I look at Microsoft, and I've lived 5 years from Microsoft for the last 25 years, okay? I've lived within 5 miles of Microsoft for 25 years now. So, a lot of what I'm telling you, nearly all of what I'm telling you is stuff that's been printed in our local newspaper or stuff I've heard at Starbucks or whatnot. So let me answer your question by saying what I think are the major factors that have contributed to where Microsoft is today versus what I think was truly world-class 20 years ago. Number one, don't get sued by the Justice Department for antitrust. Right? This whole motto of don't be evil, you should really take that seriously. And I think there are some cases where Google could, maybe take a harder look at that. And the position of being the challenger versus the position of being on top of the industry, the same behavior that's fine as the challenger is not fine when you're on top of the industry. So, I think that's a big one. I think that took a big bite out of Microsoft's morale. Number two, I think here's something you can't do anything about, but aging workforce. When I was on campus at Microsoft, the average age, not the median, but the mean was 27. All right? 1990, the median age was 27. It was increasing 0.8 years per calendar year. So we fast forward 20 years, and I don't know this. I'm extrapolating now, and I'm probably wrong. But if you extrapolate that out, the median age at Microsoft today would be like 43. Well, a lot happens to people between 27 and 43, and the ability to stay at work on Christmas Day or come back to the office after you go to the movie on Friday night is very different when you're 25 and you don't have a girlfriend versus when you're 43 and you've got 2 kids at home. So that aging workforce issue is one that you just have to figure out what to do about. You know, unless you're counting on high staff turnover, you know, that's just, you have to figure out how to make things work even as your workforce ages, and that's, you know, that's not unique to Microsoft. We've seen lots of companies that deal with that issue. I think there's been an erosion of technical leadership, right? And you guys have. We had Bill Gates, who had been more of a technical guy, and after Mike Hallman left, he went into the office of the CEO, because Bill wasn't always the CEO, right? There was a long period where Microsoft experienced explosive growth where Bill was not the president of the company, but he stepped into the presidency of the company. And you know, Google's a little different because you've got Sergey and Larry, but you know, I look at history repeating itself with Larry stepping into the CEO position after years of being in more of a technical position. So those are some things I think about. Preserving the technical core. I think you know, Ballmer's done in many ways a wonderful job at Microsoft, and you know, kept the ship afloat. But he doesn't have anywhere near the technical respect. I mean, he has 0 technical respect, I think, because that's not where he came from. Making sure that companies maintain some really extraordinarily respected technical leaders, I think, is key as well. So those would be my main thoughts.
We have a question over here, but I just want to comment as a Googler. That was a brutal, brutal answer to listen to.
Do you have a strong opinion on the correct size of a development team, especially for larger, more complex products? And then along those lines, how do you decide when to increase headcount, when not to?
7. No, actually, I think, you know, one of the things that's become clear to me as I've been doing this for more than 26 years now is there are an awful lot of software issues that are a lot more about people than they are about software. And so when you try to get a team that has, you know, you can also think of it as like, you know, a hardware loop where you want to keep your highest bandwidth connections the closest to each other. And if you start getting high bandwidth connections across too big a set of people, it doesn't work. And so you've got to figure out a way to organize your team so that you've got no more than about 7 that have the highest bandwidth connection. And then you compose larger teams out of those work groups that have no more than about 7. I think, and you know, and then you can compose those to arbitrarily large sizes. In the work that we've done over the years with companies, we've seen a number of what we've come to think of as maturity transition points. We've worked with companies typically anywhere from 50 technical staff to about 10,000 technical staff. And what we've found is that up to about 50, the organizational issues don't really matter because you can literally know every person at a size of about 50 and you can have one level of management. When you get up to about, but at 50, companies tend to struggle because they're not quite sure how to organize it, and they start feeling really inefficient. Once they work through that organizational level, hurdle, they typically add a layer of management, add a layer of structure, and that takes them up to about somewhere between 250 and 350 employees. And I think this really literally is powers of 7. And at that point, they tend to struggle again and have another organizational crisis where they really don't know how to organize the work anymore, and the team interactions aren't as efficient, and they make lots of mistakes, and they get into political skirmishes and so on. And so they tend to need to go through some sort of a reconception of how the whole organization looks somewhere in that size range. And then once they overcome that, then they're good up to, you know, maybe a couple thousand people, something like that. And that can be an organization where people are not working that coordinated, or it can be, we've seen project teams that, you know, certainly have up to at least several hundred people that can be organized along those lines. But at the individual work group level, there's actually some pretty reasonable data from a guy named Larry Putnam, who's an estimating guru, that looks at business systems all of basically the same size, and the only variation really being the team size. And what his data says is that when you increase team size from 2 to 7, that your total effort goes up, but your schedule goes down. Not that much really, but it goes down some. But once you increase team size above 7, your total effort goes up just like you'd expect, but your total schedule also goes up. So as you get beyond a work group size of something like 7, you really just end up with people tripping over each other and working across purposes and inserting defects in each other's codes, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I do think, and I don't think that has anything to do with software. I think it has to do with how well people can communicate with each other. I'm sure there are exceptions. If I've got a group of people that I've worked with for 10 years and we've very slowly added people and gotten to a work group size of 10 or 12, I'm sure there are cases out there where that works fine, but in general terms, I think it's problematic.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for the presentation. I'm Ilya. So, question kind of similar to the previous one, but not exactly the same. So, so you've said as your company or your team grows, you have to concentrate on other things to still make it successful, like, for example, quality of processes you've got.
I'm sorry, the last part?
Quality of processes you've got. But how do you actually shift, like quality of processes has been more important? Like, say, you've got a team, very good technical team, who consists of cowboys who don't care about processes. And if you try to like reconcentrate them, they just don't want to do that. If you bring in like a process guru from some other company, from outside the company, your team might become allergic to that guy, so they don't want to like accept them into the team. And that the answer seems to be pretty simple. You just do it. But I've been hearing about a lot of startups that can't make this efficiently, effectively. So, what I said.
Yeah, I mean that's a company that, or a problem or challenge that any company that experiences a high level of growth is ultimately going to run into. That when you're small, there are certain rewards of working in that company. When you're medium, there are certain rewards. When you're large, there are certain rewards. But there are some people who really prefer to work in startup mode. There are some people who really prefer to work for a larger organization. As you grow, you're not going to retain every single person. Some people are going to get older. Well, they're all going to get older, but some people their life priorities are going to change, and as the company gets bigger and more stable and so on, maybe that's fine because the same thing's happening to them. Other people are going to be looking for something new and interesting and challenging, and they're going to bail out and go look for some other startup. And I think that's just the way it happens. If I was a business owner, what I would focus on is creating the highest possible, strongest possible sense of mission about my organization so that they could I could retain people based on being bought into the mission, even if there were other collateral aspects of how the work that is done that they're no longer buying into.
Okay, I think we could probably ask you questions. I really appreciate the presentation and especially the honesty involved in it. As someone who is working for a company being sued and who's getting old, that was a good one. Let's thank both Mishko and Steve, our final two speakers of GTAC 2011. Thank you very much. Very, very good.